on national and international security.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Raisina 2021. A big welcome to our viewers across the world as Raisina goes completely virtual this year. It goes without saying that we live in unprecedented times. What has happened though in the last few years is that even as nations try to create new bonds and foster old partnerships in this post-COVID world, the region that has consistently stood out in terms of its strategic importance, as also the political and economic news flow around it, is the Indo-Pacific. While the region itself basically implies a vast maritime zone that we're talking about, it encompasses within it the interests of many players, not just those that are geographically bound by the region that we're talking about. But the big question is, even as countries emerge in some form and fashion out of the ravages of COVID, what are the imperatives for this region? Does it look like there is a new structure that has been formed post-COVID? And what are the economic imperatives of building an Indo-Pacific partnership? I am delighted to invite today my esteemed panel that will be talking about this and debating all these issues. So let me, without further ado, introduce them to our viewers. Mr. Mansukh Mandaviya, Minister of State for Ports, Shipping and Waterways, Chemical and Fertilizers, India. Welcome, sir. Thank you for joining in. Anthony Abbott, who's former Prime Minister, Australia. Thank you, Mr. Abbott, for joining into this conversation today. Tadashi Maeda, Governor, Japan Bank for International Cooperation. Tadashi-san, thank you very much for joining in with your thoughts today. Kyung-Jin Song, Director, FN Global Issues Center and Indo-Pacific Fellow at Perth, US Asia Center. Ms. Song, welcome. It's great to have you here. And of course, Kosh Arha, who's a Fellow, Atlantic Council, Scowcraft, Center for Strategy and Security, United States. Mr. Arha, welcome to you as well. Just to walk panelists and our viewers through the format of the next 45 minutes, which is the limited time for this conversation, I am going to walk you through the opening outline of this conversation, as I said. I then turn to all my guests for their opening comments, some interventions from me, and then some closing comments. We'll try very much to make this a tight but very deliberate conversation. So let's get right into it. Mr. Mandaviya, if I can begin, sir, India's geographic definition of the Indo-Pacific has literally meant from the shores of Africa to the shores of America. What are some of the efforts being made by India to enhance the cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region?
Our Indian policy is it that neighbors first has always been guiding principle of our government. India always has played a pivotal role and taken a lead for the betterment of the entire region. India has been considering all the countries of entire region as growth partner. I would like to list some initiatives which show India's commitment towards betterment of all the countries of Indo-Pacific region. First is BIMSTEC, the Bay of Bengal initiative for multi-sectoral technical and economic cooperation, comprising Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Thailand. Second is SAGAR, which means security and growth for all in the region. Third is Project Mosam. Fourth is EWAC-TG, which means the Eastern Waterways Connectivity Transport Grid, and Chabahar and International North-South Transport Corridor, called INSTC. These are some examples of how India believes in partnering with neighboring countries.
Thank you for that. So indeed, as I mentioned earlier and as you outlined, there are many sort of players within this context. Mr. Abbott, let me turn to you and let me request you perhaps to put into your opening comments the context of the Quad, because we cannot have a conversation about the Indo-Pacific without considering the importance the Quad has now achieved, perhaps for the first time as a financial and economic alternative as well. Would you say this is an outcome of the pandemic, sir? And what are your thoughts on this region now?
Well, thank you very much, Mitali. Obviously, the Quad is extremely significant because for the first time it links the major democracies of our region in an informal partnership to deal with all of the troubles of our times. Now, the title of this session is The Architecture of the Future, Building a New Indo-Pacific. And I suppose the question begs, what is the architecture designed to respond to? And at the risk of being extremely blunt, obviously we have a challenge, and the challenge comes from China. Australia's Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has recently said that there's a whiff of the 1930s about these times. Others have said that we're on the brink of a new Cold War. I'd prefer to hope that nothing more ominous than a cold peace now exists between China and much of the rest of the world. But however described, it's by far the most important strategic challenge the world faces, and the forces of liberal democracy are losing fast, essentially because we've allowed China to do to us what they'd never allow us to do to them. Thanks to fundamental decency and goodwill, they've bought our businesses, adopted our technology, partnered with our institutions, and with their numbers and their natural ability, they're on track to become the world's strongest economy within a decade, and subsequently the world's strongest military. Yet the Chinese Communist Party's intention was never to evolve via an oriental version of glasnost and perestroika into a federal liberal democracy. And in any event, Russia has itself reverted to Tsarism, just as the world has realised that China now has a new emperor. Rather, the CCP's intention was always to hide its strength and bide its time till it could resume its rightful place as the world's middle kingdom. Marxism-Leninism has reinforced traditional Chinese exceptionalism, and if anyone doubts that our destiny in a Chinese-dominated world is to, quote, tremble and obey, look at the treatment of Australia. Routinely derided as a piece of chewing gum on China's boot, that's had our exports blocked and our ministers banned, all because we had the temerity to be the first to call for an independent inquiry into the origins of the pandemic. If we look around at the disappeared citizen reporters who dared to express their own views, the interned Uyghurs who don't want to assimilate, the oppressed citizens of Hong Kong who only wanted the one country, two systems that was pledged to them, and above all, the threatened people of Taiwan, whose liberal democracy with Chinese characteristics is a fundamental reproach to the notion there's a totalitarian gene in the Chinese makeup. All these testify to the shape of the world to come on current trends. Now, of course, becoming tributary to China is not a fate we're doomed to. Over time, a more strategic approach to trade and investment that takes China out of critical supply chains would reduce our vulnerability to economic pressure. More selectivity about who may study and who may partner with us, especially in high tech, would minimise our exposure to intellectual theft. New strategic arrangements such as the Quad, incredibly important, could raise the stakes against China further bullying its neighbours. And over time, our own Chinese descended citizens might help to foster the liberal thinking in China that a taste of market freedom so far hasn't. But, and here's the big question, how can countries stand up for themselves if they don't believe in themselves? And It is now conventional wisdom that the coal-fired power stations, for instance, that China can't build enough of, are destroying the planet if they're built in a Western country. It's widely accepted, at least in Western educational systems, that the English-speaking countries in particular that have given the world its common language, its democratic institutions, its industrial revolution, and its emancipation of minorities are irredeemably oppressive. Now, not for a moment I think that the pandemic was somehow orchestrated out of China, but all the fear and the confusion, the argument and the antagonism over lockdowns, border closures and vaccine rollouts would have encouraged Beijing to think that it was pushing against an open door.
Sure.
Now, to conclude, belief in the brotherhood of man and the equal treatment of all, the best features of Western civilization and arguably the universal aspiration of mankind, they're needed more than ever, but so is a sense of cultural self-belief and perspective, not just to see the good in others and the fault in ourselves, because the risk is a new generation of, to use Lenin's term, useful idiots, providing our competitor with the economic and the cultural ammunition to use against us.
Thank you for your opening comments. Safe to say the stakes are raised for this conversation as well with the opening comments you had to make, sir. Let me turn to Tadashi-san to bring in more financial flavor perhaps to our conversation. What do you see as the urgency now, Tadashi-san, to move in terms of building financial partnerships in the Indo-Pacific, particularly with reference to the point made about supply chains and the disruptions faced there through the last couple of years?
Thank you, Jari. Tadashi Mai, the governor of Japan Bank for International Cooperation, or JBIC, which is 100% owned by the government, but independently managed by the board of directors, which I chair. First of all, I'd like to point out that the concept of the free and open Indo-Pacific was initially introduced by former Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, in 2007 at his speech at Indian Parliament, at the first time of his prime ministership. And we have been working very closely with a partner in the United States and Australia, trilateral partnership. And our partnership in the U.S. is USDFC and also that State Department and National Security Council of the White House. And from Australia, we have been closely working with DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and Export Finance Australia. So we have sending the joint mission to the country in the Pacific Island countries, and also countries like Indonesia and Vietnam, which are part of the region of the South China Sea. Therefore, that we have been very keen on financing the strategic project, especially quality infrastructure in the region. So JBIC is playing a role of spearhead of the financial institution in Japan to support this quality infrastructure in the region. And most recently on April 16th, the first head of state summit meeting among the Quad was conducted. And before this summit meeting on Quad, I received a phone call from a long-term friend of mine, the Kirk Campbell, who is now appointed as a Indo-Pacific coordinator at the National Security Council of the White House. And upon his request, we have been supporting that so-called Quad vaccine, strengthening vaccine, the producing capacity in India. And also the supply chains of the critical technology like semiconductors or high voltage battery and so on. It's very important, as a Prime Minister Abbott referred to, that we have been very strategically coordinating each other. And as a first case, by the way, together with a U.S. compact and also that new program of DFAT of Australia, we materialized the submarine cable project from Palau to Echo ECHO project, which is connect Singapore and west coast of the United States. So Palau is a country of tourism, but due to the COVID-19, very unfortunately, the country is now shut down. It's closed. It's a border, so they are struggling. However, that as a result of the close coordination among three countries, we could materialize the project of this submarine cable project to Palau. And also, Biden administration of the United States, the score of the importance of climate change. Therefore, that we have been, JBIC is a founding partner of the Blue Dot network, originally introduced by the Trump administration. But Biden's administration decided to continue this, and this is a process under the G20. The announcement was in 2019. And also that the new element, like carbon neutral, will be introducing to this framework of Blue Dot network. We have been working on this issue. So in a nutshell, the Quad concept is the most valuable and important partnership to make this region peace and prosperous, and also that towards the future. And we need to demonstrate how this partnership is robust and strong against China, as Prime Minister Abe said. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that. Let me turn to Ms. Song. Ms. Song, you've heard 3 points of view now. One that perhaps looks at building a more collaborative setup, and 2 that indicate that perhaps the key imperative at this point is to take on the challenges by China, financial, economic, or otherwise. I would love to hear your opening comments and how you see the future for this Indo-Pacific construct. You will need to unmute yourself, please.
In this panel, I think I'm the only one from a non-Quad country, so to speak. So let me just, talk about how the Quad can be, more effective and inclusive in this context of the, more positive, optimistic economic outlook, and also given the fact that we're still living very much deep in the, COVID-19 pandemic crisis. Okay, so overall, the Indo-Pacific economic outlook looks very positive. The region will bounce back strongly after the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, provided that we manage it properly. And COVID-19 has a different, economic impact on different countries in the Indo-Pacific region. For instance, the developed economies with a strong manufacturing base were less hurt by the pandemic crisis last year, whereas developing countries with a strong services sector like India were more heavily affected by the pandemic crisis. But this year's economic outlook looks very good, and the IMF forecast Asia to grow 7.6% this year and 5.4% next year, after a negative growth of 1.5% last year. And I think the region is also likely to benefit from the huge fiscal packages from the U.S. and demand from U.S. and China as well. The U.S. fiscal package of $1.9 trillion, and also the infrastructure plan of $2 trillion will boost domestic demand and output in the United States, which means the U.S. will import more goods from the Indo-Pacific region, such as raw materials from Australia, for instance, and industrial intermediate goods. So. And also the financial market, global financial market looks good, on the back of the very low interest rate policy regime. So, you know, it's no secret that when the US economy is good, the global economy is good. So it's estimated that 1 percentage point growth in the US economy will add 0.16 percentage point to the global economy. So it looks, the Indo-Pacific looks set to be a growth engine of the region and the world, as it has been for some time. And I think the Indo-Pacific is also a test bed for reducing the widening income gap and inequality, and also ensuring the rules-based international order. But of course, it will all depend on our response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So the first thing first, what's most important at this point, I think in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, with no end in sight to really make more vaccines available, especially to low and middle-income countries in the Indo-Pacific region. You know, without vaccination, we will not emerge from the pandemic, and we will not return to a meaningful growth trajectory. So we must do away with the vaccine nationalism, which is going against the spirit of multilateralism and going against the free, open, and prosperous Indo-Pacific. So vaccinations have become a new essential, I think, infrastructure in this age of the coronavirus pandemic, without which a return to growth and normality is unthinkable at this point. But as you know, we are faced with the problem of shortage of vaccines because manufacturers are reluctant to invest more in production facilities because it's very expensive, and it's thought to be, it's not going to be, you know, the pandemic is not going to be with us forever. And we are also in short supply of highly skilled technical personnel to deal with the manufacturing process. And vaccine supply chain is often very vulnerable to national regulatory barriers. So for example, national regulatory barriers prevent the essential raw materials from reaching manufacturers. So given this, I think we may also consider putting more public investment in the vaccine production capacity, and inviting more private investors to co-invest in the vaccine production facility. Then you may ask, you know, what do we do after? What do we do with this extra capacity after the pandemic is gone? Well, I think I'm thinking aloud. The extra vaccine capacity may be picked up by a multilateral organization, say the WHO, for you know, R&D to fight future pandemics and communicable diseases. Then where do we get the necessary funding? Well, we can perhaps pool resources, you know, together multilaterally from like-minded countries, companies, donors to support it. And if we indeed get the extra, you know, facility capacity under the WHO, I think it will. It can also provide a very good opportunity for the WHO members to really look into the overdue issue of the lack of funding at WHO to improve its funding and its sustainability. That may, after all, you know, help WHO to restore its damaged credibility.
Yeah.
So in this regard, I think the U.S. leadership is critical.
I'm going to come back to you, Ms. Song. Since time is of essence, I want to get an opening comment from our other panelists as well, and then we'll open up the conversation. Kosh, the onerous task of threading together everything that you heard in your opening comments is now on you. And if I may add on Ms. Song, on whether the Indo-Pacific or the Quad indeed has the wherewithal to take on the task of vaccination and ensuring equity in vaccination, along with the other, you know, the other imperatives that stand at this moment.
Sure. Well, good morning. Thanks again, and good to see Maeda-san. We launched the Blue Dot Network. I appreciate you mentioning it. The question was more about the architecture of Indo-Pacific. I'm happy to sort of talk about specific, but the 2 days everybody's talking about what may do in the infinite detail. But let's address something a little bit more broader. Your answer whether Quad is capable? Yes, it's more than capable to address the vaccination and others. The main issue on Quad and the activities of the 4 countries is which is lacking in ambition, scope, and branding. There's a tremendous amount of good effort going on, but I think there's a degree of issue. We need to raise the ambition scale and the branding of Quad activities more than where it is today, in response to Belt and Road Initiative, Made in China 2025, whatever they are. In so doing, there are good lessons to be learned on the architectural issues from the transatlantic that can be applicable and learn from and build upon and improve in the Indo-Pacific. So in the previous engagement, when we had this ideological struggle between a Marxist-Leninist European way of dealing things, and then the American and so-called Western democracies stood against it, and the Western capital markets did. Today, we are in an ideological struggle of a socialism with Chinese characteristics, which can only be rebutted strongly by democracies with Asian characteristics. So I think that's very important to put that up front. This ideological stuff of socialism with Chinese characteristics, best rebutted by democracies with Asian characteristics. No bigger democracy than India, the marvel of India, the great resolute, the strength of Taiwan and what used to be Hong Kong, the strength of Japan and South Korea, the soundness of Australia and New Zealand, the aspiration and ambitions of ASEAN countries in Central Asia and Mongolia. I think that's what it is. The second is we also need to rebut this state capitalistic model with free market and free society model. So how do you do that? In the transatlantic one, we came up with, of course, the security and also the economic engagement. They need to be improved on in the Indo-Pacific one. And I think that's where we are. Like the Quad, I think we'll have to address the issue of trade. You have to. I think one of the biggest, perhaps, fallacies and follies was for the United States to walk away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So I think a new engagement of how do you do trade, because if you have to listen to Tony, and I think right as Prime Minister Abbott said, that the important is the collective action against a country that only knows that might makes right. So that has to be responded collectively. So there should be a trade and economic relationship among the countries. There needs to be a development finance relationship. You already have the strong partnership between JPIC and DFC, and to the degree that, your own DPA in US, in India, and the DFAT. But let's invite the Europeans, and let's develop an Indo-Pacific fund of various development finance organizations that can contribute to it for investment within the region for all the economic reasons that talk, building on the US DFC and JBIC partnership and EXIM and NEXI. Then let's also talk about, I couldn't be more impressed by Minister Mandavia's issues of BIMSTEC, of Sagar, of MOSAM. They're very outstanding partnership. But when you talk about 5 things, I get confused. So we need to, again, brand them under one big umbrella that talks about all of this, which has many elements within this. And so I think that's the branding and the scale and the ambition side. And 3 just quick points on what we can go specifically on that. So digital is obviously a big deal. Huawei. So I think commend the Quad on coming up with the Open Radio Access Network. There's an alternative business model. Well, let's go one step forward. Let's talk about in the modern technology of heterogeneous integrated network. How do we use the SpaceX satellite, the submarine cables that Maeda-san just talked about, and the Wi-Fi 6, that the new Cisco, and the Open Radio Access Network, they're all going to work together. Let's brand it. Let's have the Indo-Pacific be the main region to invest and talk about it. That's the kind of ambition that we need, as opposed to playing catch-up. You got to set the standard. Blue Dot Network is the operationalization of the quality infrastructure investment. The India's Coalition for Disaster Resilience Infrastructure and Blue Dot Network is the right way to operationalize the quality infrastructure statement with the new climate carbon neutral element. Another one, let's talk about how the East-West corridor between Vietnam, Thailand, Myanmar to India, how does that work with India to Europe? And let's talk about a connectivity of the Southern Corridor. These are the kind of ambitious projects with all BIMSTEC and SAGA and MOSAM and SARC and Heart of Asia, all of them come together. And then energy. We've got to talk about energy in a big way, and not only in natural gas and solar, but the grid. Japan and JBIC are the biggest investor in transmission lines globally. Let's connect the Mekong power pool to the subcontinent power pool, and let's see how we can make an electric grid that drives this and part of the BIMSTEC. And two last things I would submit before we go back. The biggest thing that India has got going is the soft power. China cannot match India's soft power in this particular case. Can we not have, instead of having Indian Institute for Technology and Indian Institute for Management, why cannot we have Indo-Pacific Institute for Technology and Indo-Pacific Institute for Management, championed by the IIMs and IIT in partnership with Quad University throughout the Indo-Pacific? Those are the kind of things I think that needs to be talked about in the architecture as we go back. So look at the scale, ambition, and branding. A lot better to be done than when we are today. And it's all building on what we're already doing. It's not talking about doing a lot of new stuff. It's just talking about it in a little bit more bold rather than timid ways and addressing these things. Thank you.
Right. There is an reason which people certainly to relook how educational institutions are set up. But let's talk about the crux of it, which will of course be finances. Mr. Mandavia, let me turn to you again, sir. You've heard enough about the financial urgency here. How can this region be the investment destination post-COVID?
It's a good question. I must admit that COVID has helped us to recognize our strength as well as it has exposed our weakness. All the countries have made their fight strong against COVID with the support of other countries. For example, India has sent life-saving medicine assistance like hydroxychloroquine, paracetamol, azithromycin, etc., which are very crucial drugs for COVID management, by sparing from countries need with smart management. Vaccine is also an example of the cooperation. India has helped many countries of the region to maintain their supply chain during the COVID. The same way, all the countries have helped each other during this tough time. There would be a new economy is the entire region after COVID. The dynamics of world economy are changing rapidly. Keeping pace with this changing economy is challenging tasks for all the countries of this region. However, this has also created so many opportunities with the changing geopolitical scenario. With the cooperation, this region would emerge as a strong economy altogether. Thank you.
Thank you for that, sir. Mr. Abbott, let me turn to you though about a certain reality that does exist in the context of this conversation. US President Biden's suggestion to UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson just a few days back about democratic countries having an infrastructure plan to rival the BRI. It's obviously an admission of reality as it exists. I mean, at last count, we're standing at a staggering 139 countries that are part of the BRI outline. Do we have enough go right now to build a credible alternative? And what do you think this means for the Quad nations relooking their trade imperatives or their view on trade? As you heard earlier, that has been a sticky point. Do you think this is when America particularly starts giving a rethink about how they've been approaching trade?
I think it's good that leaders of the stature of President Biden and Prime Minister Johnson have woken up to the scale of the challenge that we face. I think what's happened is that around the globe, people have suddenly realised that everything that the Chinese government does is done with strategic intent. This isn't like, it's not kind of no strings attached foreign aid. This is all designed to bring countries into China's orbit. And once in China's orbit, they will then be subjected to increasing pressure to stay in China's orbit and to get out of any relationship that they might have had with countries such as the United States and others. So I think it is good that we are belatedly waking up to the scale of our challenge. The difficulty is going to be converting things like the Quad into meaningful action as opposed to simply a notional informal partnership. Now, one of the things that has been said earlier, it's a real pity that the United States pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a real pity. And the quicker we can get America back into the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the quicker that we can expand the Trans-Pacific Partnership, make it, if you like, an Indo-Pacific Partnership, maybe even a global democratic partnership, I think the better for everyone. So we've got to turn our awareness of the challenge, our abundance of goodwill into practical initiatives that will strengthen the peace-loving and the democratic countries of the world.
Tadashi-san, let me nuance that question a little bit more for you, particularly with regards to those nations that are not part of the Quad. How do we make this more accessible to them, especially in terms of financial support? And if I may add, a corollary to that as well, if we go by the definitive database reports that we have, at some point, the mid of last year, we were looking at 2,600 projects at a cost of $3.7 trillion from the BRI. What kind of figures are we working with on the other end?
Thank you for the question. Actually, before answering your question, we need to know how that the current performance of the BRI of China. I analyze that what's going on in BRI, that the major two financial institutions which represent a BRI in China, China Development Bank and Export Bank, Import Bank of China, their commitment has been significantly declined. Peaking out in 2017, the commitment in 2019, just before COVID, was almost is 70% decline from the peak. So what's happened? That because probably that's now the United States tried to squeeze the capital from U.S. to China using the peaceful registration, also that executive order. And President Biden continued to work in a similar way with former President. So it's really effective, number one. Number two, that free and open Indo-Pacific is not just only that it to be expanded. That's the fact that we talk about the UK. Actually, UK already, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson, already officially announced that they will join that negotiation with CPTPP. So, and also that Estonia, by the way, Estonia, which is one of the Baltic 3 states, they already declined from the 17+1 of the Chinese Institute to focus on Central and Eastern Europe. And now Poland, for example, the Polish government strongly promoting the idea of 3 Seas initiative, and they're going to create a fund for 3 Seas initiative fund. So if we can share the same common value and a free and open liberal democratic platform, we can share and we can expand financially. And it's a good chance right now because the Chinese BRI is declining right now, so that we need to know what exactly is going on.
Tom, is there a greater sense of faith or camaraderie between the Indo-Pacific partners post-COVID? And what do you think would help in that regard? Would it be creating more multipolar supply chains, creating more bilateral or multilateral financial institutions? What would go best for trust at this point?
So we already have some of a exchange of the views and data sharing with a multinational organization like ADB or IFC, the World Bank Group, which is very effective, very effective. And but the creation of a multinational kind of organization, will be costly, maybe costly, and therefore that it is not a practical way. Therefore, that bilateral engagement and also trilateral, any kind of engagement is necessary. But I think that the bottom line, the key platform must be Quad. So Quad plus something. That's a more practical approach, in my view. Okay,
Ms. Song, would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Taking your point, last point, the Quad plus. Some people in non-Quad countries have a negative feeling about adopting the name Quad plus. I don't think that's an important point, but people have a negative image if you put it like that, Quad plus, without changing the name into something new with a new membership. And how do we make the Quad more attractive? Well, going back to my previous point, if the Quad vaccine partnership, as agreed at the Quad summit in March, if they can work on it and if they can deliver within that framework in partnership with non-Quad countries, I think that will be a very good initiative if it is delivered as promised. And I think it will prove to the world that Quad is indeed useful and effective to move ahead with the common agenda. And I also think, regarding the funding for infrastructure in the region, I think we can take advantage of the pension funds, both public and private. For instance, in Korea's national pension fund is the 3rd largest in the world. And I think we can encourage such pension funds to, make a more and bolder investment in infrastructure, and in partnership with, other countries, and multilaterally in partnership with, say, Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, and you may not agree with me, but even the AIIB, because no one institution has sufficient capital to meet the infrastructure demand alone. And regarding the trade issue, I think the regional trade deal will also help the Indo-Pacific regions, a free, open, prosperous Indo-Pacific region. It's a real great pity that the U.S. withdrew from the CPTPP. But it may not happen in the first half of the Biden administration, but I think it will happen probably in the second half of the Biden administration that the U.S. will rejoin. And if the U.S. will rejoin, the CPTPP area will represent, 40%, about 40% of the global GDP. And speaking from a, again, non-CPTPP country, I think Korea needs to join the CPTPP as soon as possible because it has already expressed its interest in joining CPTPP.
Okay, just 2 minutes left for our conversation. Would you set out goalposts, 1 or 2 or 3 of them in the years to come that really demonstrate the power and heft of the Quad or the Indo-Pacific?
Well, Mitali, good question. One thing that would certainly help as far as Australia is concerned would be a trade deal with India. We've been talking about it on and off now for quite some time. There was a lot of, I think, momentum back in my time as Prime Minister and when Prime Minister Modi first came into office. I do think that this is a very that could accelerate the strong and practical partnerships within the Quad. Now, obviously, India already has a deal with Japan. If there were some way of getting the United States back into the TPP and then maybe India thinking along the same lines, I think that's probably the best thing that could be done right now.
All excellent points. I really appreciate your thoughts and insight and joining us from across the globe really for this conversation today. My thanks to all our guests. Completely out of time, unfortunately, but thank you for joining in today. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
आज रात 12 बजे से संपूर्ण देश में लॉकडाउन होने जा रहा है।